He fights for scoops, he fights corruption, he even fights for real in the ring. Meet the boxer behind the website Voice of OC, Norberto Santana, next on Inside OC. Inside OC is brought to you by 5 Point Communities. 5 Point Communities is an independently owned real estate development company with assets under management throughout California. Hi, I'm Rick Reef. Welcome to this test run edition of Inside OC. Well, as print newspapers struggle to survive, other forms of journalism are popping up online. One such effort is right here in Orange County, a nonprofit investigative newsroom called Voice of OC. The guy who heads up this new style newsroom has an old school pedigree, including years at the Orange County Register, where he was a top investigative reporter. Joining me, the publisher of Voice of OC, Norberto Santana. Amigo, good to have you on.
Good to have you. Good to be here. Thanks.
What's Voice of OC?
It's a nonprofit investigative news agency. We're part of a movement across the United States of about 100 newsrooms, where basically a lot of communities have agreed that it's important to take civic reporting out of the hands of local corporations, or frankly not local corporations, and in a sense try to dive deeper into our city halls, county governments, many of the quality of life issues that require really in-depth reporting.
So what's wrong with corporations?
There's nothing wrong with corporations. I mean, obviously our entire economy is financed by them, run by them, and everything. What you don't want is unchecked corporate power, especially when it comes to your news pages.
Well, how about just unchecked power?
Fair enough. Unchecked power, in a sense, the only reason I mention corporations is because they're the ones that are purchasing newspapers more and more and more, and at the same time are downsizing them more and more and more to increase profit margins, which is what a corporation does and wants and desires, and as it should.
But that's how they make cars too, right?
Of course, but you don't make news in the same way you make cars. And that is, I think, in the 21st century, we're realizing that and it's not just on a whim, it's after a decade of watching corporate buyouts and purchases of family-owned newspapers and seeing what's happened to the news coverage, which is it gets smaller and smaller.
Well, you and I could argue all day about that kind of thing, and perhaps we should, but I think something that I think you would agree with me on is that regardless of what the forces are, there is less and less coverage, it seems, of local news, at least in the traditional journalistic sense. We've got a lot of things online now, but as far as really journalists covering what's going on in communities, that seems to be imperiled.
Absolutely. That's why we call it in some ways a joke with Voice of OC that it's, back to the future, in the sense of it's a return to your old-fashioned city hall reporters who would hang out in the halls of power and literally what's being heard, what's being discussed, what's going to happen next week. How often does your local newspaper tell you about a vote that happened last week, whether it's a supermarket, a store, a big development, and the message entirely is these decisions have already been made, and I'm telling you about it after the fact. Voice of OC and many of these investigative newsrooms are aimed solely at civics. We don't have the cost structure that your traditional newspaper does. We're in a sense engine mechanics of local government. That's all we do day in, day out. We're not switching reporters in and out of beats, so that our reporters in a sense have a historical background to their beats, their politicians, the issues that really allows you to drive a race car fast when you're a reporter like that, as opposed to being dropped into one beat after another, which unfortunately is the case at many of your traditional newspapers these days.
So let's talk about the traditional newspapers versus what you do. Voice of OC, you have about, 5 staffers?
Yeah.
So 5 people.
Right.
And as you say, you're mechanics and you're very good at what you do.
Right.
But you're 5 people. I mean,
True.
The Register has, about 150 reporters or so, the Orange
True.
County Register. So what would you say, what is it that a newspaper like the Register does well? What is it that you do well?
I think your traditional newspaper, in a sense, is a great sort of convening place for your community. It can give you entertainment stories, it can give you stories of local interest. It can, in a sense, as you said, be a repository. It has hundreds of reporters. What it doesn't seem to do well over time, look at the Angel Stadium coverage a sports page that is dependent on getting back in there, connected to advertisers, having a very difficult time. And don't take my word for it, read Columbia Journalism Review, which compared Voice of OC's stadium coverage to the Register's stadium coverage in those early days. And it found that basically we went after the engine. We took it apart. We told taxpayers exactly what was at stake in a very sort of straightforward way. The Register had a much tougher time with that story for a variety of reasons that both I know of and don't know of. There's your difference. When you have somebody that just deals with local city government and county government day in, day out, there's a level of expertise that you're going to have that traditional newspaper just is not investing the money into.
But they have reporters too that have been.
They do, but they switch editors around left and right. They switch reporters around left and right. You tell me, we've had the same reporter on Anaheim and Santa Ana and Irvine and the county and the transportation agency for 5 years. You cannot say the same for the Register. They've had a dozen reporters in and out of those beats.
Well, they have had some political reporters that have been on the beat. But anyways,
No,
yeah. and I would expect you're the voice of OC. Of course, you feel strongly about what you do. But
And I'll point out, we have a partnership with the Register, because again, we're not here to replace the traditional newspaper.
And I have a partnership with the Register too. At least I did until we started talking about this. No, just kidding.
Sure,
But I do have a partnership too. But as I'm sure that as some people out there, people who read you religiously, people who are covered by you,
sure.
People, you certainly have become part of the fabric, the political fabric of Orange County. So I can hear some of those folks say, well, all right, so Norberto's taking a shot at the big paper. He's taking a shot at corporate interests. Norberto, your financial backer is the Orange County Employees Association. So your big financial backer is the Public Employees Union in Orange County. So aren't you beholden?
What I'd say is, again, we have investors. They are one investor that began with us. Over time, given how quality our coverage has been and how balanced our coverage has been, we've had the Knight Foundation come on. We've had Ethics and Excellence in Journalism come on. We've had the Orange County Community Foundation come on as investors. We've had the California Endowment come on as investors. We've had trial attorneys like Wiley Aiken come on as investors as well. Mm-hmm. What I would say to that is what any politician says who has a donor list, which is the key to independence is to have a varied investor list. And that's exactly what we've done. From day one, we approached this in a very sort of small business-like forum. I approached this as an entrepreneur from day one and took investments from stakeholders immediately, which OCEA was one of them. I think in some ways labor is a great partner because people from labor are of both Republicans and Democrats. That may sound crazy today, but guys like Ronald Reagan were actually supported by the Teamsters. There's no better place in your local union hall to have raucous debates about politics. Now, many people here in Orange County have a sort of a jaundiced view of labor and its representation of collective bargaining and working people's rights. However, I'd tell you that if you go to your local PAC meeting at the local labor union, it's a raucous debate. There's a lot more. You don't think that the Orange County Deputy Sheriff's Union has more Republicans in it than Democrats? Easily. So I'd say in that sense, it's a more varied institution than people realize.
Given though that its genesis is, coming really, it was, Nick Berardino, sure. the former head of the now retired, and by the way, a guy who's queued up to be a guest on this show. Mm-hmm. Because it started with him, why would they do that? Why would a labor union decide we want to have a news organization?
Sure, I think that in some ways back in 2009, as you said, me and Nick knew each other very well. And I'd point out that in 2004, when I landed here, I did some of the most aggressive reporting on a pension deal, 2.7 at 55, which to this day I am very proud of. I still remember Bill Campbell, the supervisor at the time, holding up me and Tony Saavedra's investigative piece on actuarial assumptions and pension systems.
In other words, saying that this deal that the union was pushing and which they got through, yeah. they could be a financial problem down
Absolutely.
Down the road.
We pointed out that these deals, like many, are predicated upon by certain actuarial assumptions that can change. And if they change, here's what you could be looking at. We were proven exactly right on that. I think that, again,
and despite that,
well, I think it speaks to, again, what OCA was interested in at the time. What I challenged them and other community leaders, which is to say, you need to have real civic coverage. You need to have an umpire that can call balls and strikes. people understand, and OCI I think is one of those interests, that without an umpire, you don't get a baseball game, you just get chaos, because there is nobody that you can point to and say, does that number figure out? Is that what this person's saying is correct or not? I think at the time, I know that the union felt that much of the pension coverage was really jaundiced and biased, and many reporters took sort of quick and easy shots without really delving in. And I agreed in that sense of what you need is in-depth coverage. In-depth coverage gives you fairness. What I have found out over 30 years of political reporting, and I've been doing it since I was a young boy, people, even when there's hard coverage, can live with accuracy and fairness. And that doesn't mean that it's soft, but it's accurate and it's fair. As long as you deliver that level of professionalism in your coverage, my assumption was they would support that and they would see value in that, because again, you have more intelligent coverage of policy, you get better policy. Right. And they, as a stakeholder, I mean, they do represent almost 20,000 public workers across Orange County, they have an interest, a stake in these agencies being economically viable, being good places to work at, and be doing good policy. Right. I'd say if you looked at also what we've been able to produce, I mean, today you have real discussions about ethics panels, you have real discussions about animal shelters, you have real discussions about pensions, you have real discussions about wages. In some ways that was really starting to kind of be tethered. If you don't have that kind of basic coverage, again, it's like a boxing ring. You cannot have both players get in and, in a sense, have a clean fight.
So that leaves you, it's a great concept. It leaves you in a tough position. By the way, I've heard Nick also say that the main reason he wanted to do this was because he wasn't asking for a partisan shake in his favor, but he wanted a fair shake. He felt that the coverage in Orange County was basically anti-union, so let's have an objective source. But maybe not Nick, but there's members, there's labor union members who maybe expect a little something else. On the other side, you have people, more conservatives who are saying, well, how can we trust anything these guys are saying? So what position does that put you in? How have you negotiated those two sides?
It's been difficult. What I've always said to politicians, for example, is explain to me how you manage relationships. And what I have found is don't be unafraid. When there's an issue with someone who is being written about that they're not going to like it, be out in front, call them for comment, seek what their opinion is. Whatever their opinion is, adjust into the stories. Be fair. The other thing, frankly, has been is, look, I had a father who stood up in Cuba to people like Fidel Castro and told the truth. When he came to this country and told me always, stick with the truth shall set you free. And it does. In a sense, what we do is act as engine mechanics. I call them as I see them. As long as everybody knows that. The worst thing that an umpire ever does is to start to change calls, or a ref, start to change anything. You tell people that you make the best calls based on the best information that you have, and you do it with purity of heart, and you have a good, hard work ethic. With that, I'm comfortable with whichever way it goes. I've always been ready to fold up shop tomorrow and move back to DC where I used to work and cover Congress and do that again. The beautiful thing about being a newspaper man is kind of what my father taught me as a machinist.
And by the way, right now we're looking at a picture of you interviewing a rather prominent Californian, Jerry Brown.
There's always work for somebody who's willing to be an honest political reporter covering government. So in that sense, I've never worried about what will happen, if anything. I think in that sense, politicians, look, my favorite politicians, Theodore Roosevelt. The idea of get up in the morning, do your job. When it's all said and done, when the bell goes ding, ding, it's over. And so try to be as hard as you can, try to get out there, be as fair as you can, be as energetic as you can. And hopefully, if enough players inside the game feel as if, hey, this is a site that I can go to get some good news. And like I told people on day one, I can tell you what we're going to be all night long. You will see it in the daily coverage. And again, just like a boxer, you will see it ring by ring, round by round, what it is that I'm doing, what it is that I'm not doing. And frankly, you saw people like now State Senator John Morlock quotes our stories again and again and again and again. Doesn't always like the coverage, doesn't always like maybe our take on things, but has always respected us and is always engaged as well.
I think that says a lot, because obviously John Morlock and Nick Berardino have been like the arch enemies, if you will, when it comes to the issues of pensions and everything else. And yet John has been, I think, a booster of your site in many ways.
Absolutely. I think people like him, Republican Mayor of Anaheim, Tom Tate, a huge, in a sense, fan of having information about politics and government out there in something that's not necessarily a he said, she said manner, with real facts, with real numbers, so that people can make their own choices about issues.
Yeah. So in the comments you were just making, you mentioned your father. So tell us about that. Tell us a little bit about your background, your father, and how you wound up sitting here today.
Sure. My dad was was a Cuban. Grew up in Cuba his whole life. Was a very poor kid in Havana. Was a Navy man. Basically an enlisted guy when the Cuban Revolution hit in 1959. Him and my mom married in 1962, and immediately my dad was a staunch Catholic and anti-communist who basically stood up, as I said, in rooms, throngs full of people, chanting Fidel, 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 and left and went to Miami. When he got to Miami, he basically continued to move and came out to LA, where he had some friends that sponsored him out here. And you would not have a more conservative person, also a pro-labor person, was a Teamster his whole life, worked and believed in what the labor movement is about. And again, very conservative guy, was a black belt in judo, trained all the time, worked out all the time, was a champion weightlifter. Just a great, great guy. Friends used to say he looked like The Rock. I mean, in a sense, he was just a very well-built guy, very kind of mild-mannered. My mom was a small business person. We grew up in doing flowers and bridal shops. We grew up in Whittier, birthplace of Richard Nixon. Went to SC. I always say I went to SC by selling flowers on the road stands. Very much grew up in small business. That's why basically in 2009, when I started seeing what was happening in the news business, I thought, wait a minute, the only place that I don't put on my BS detector is when I walk inside and I hear my publisher talk to me about, what they're doing. And our business model seems basically sort of broken. So I did what I learned as a boy, which was small business. That was, in my view, the American dream. That is what took us from one generation of being Cuban exiles, refugees from communism, to basically in Whittier with a home quickly, and when we were able to work in small business our whole life, put ourselves through Catholic schools and university, and learned all the great bedrocks of this country, which again, it isn't left and it isn't right. It's what's fair, what's right, and what is defensible. And frankly, as a boy, I was schooled in politics. My dad used to take a bilingual ballot for all those Republicans out there that don't like bilingualism. And this was a guy who was pretty much a Democrat but voted Republican all the way until Ronald Reagan, and then became a Republican, just like many of his Teamster buddies. But this is a guy who we sat in our house. Elections were religious events, just like boxing was. We would sit down, go through a sample ballot, and my dad was the best analyst of politics I've ever known, because they were always basic questions. You want a school bond? We just had one a couple of years ago, didn't we, Norberto? And I'd have to say, yeah, Dad, let's fish out that sample ballot, go through it. And this guy remembered dollars and cents, asked important questions. I used to see what his voting sense was. And again, I never met a better sort of barometer of politics than my old man. And again, that's what really gave me a passion for politics. Being Cuban, you realize that this is a game for keeps. There are winners, there are losers. You can look over there at a regime and see what happens when the bad guys win, and that's what we looked at. So here in politics, I've always taken it very, very seriously. That's what we were educated to do. And frankly, my father told me again, it's every citizen's right, not your desire or anything else. It's your responsibility to get out there and be involved in your government, because if not, it can blow up. And literally, my dad used to play. I'm from one of those places, like Krypton, that blew up. It doesn't exist anymore. The Cuba that he grew up in. Frankly, that's what I've always taken to my local reporting when it comes to politics, which is this matters. This is important.
So how do you feel now about the rapprochement with Cuba?
I think it's a difficult process. I mean, I was talking to my mom not too long ago, and she said it was a very hard thing to see the Pope celebrate a mass in the Plaza of the Revolution, where so many people were shot by firing squads 50 years ago. Having said all of that, and I worked with dissidents inside Cuba, and my first career was working for the National Endowment for Democracy. I actually worked for the International Republican Institute, worked with dissidents inside Cuba. It's a difficult process to see, but one that I think that we should move forward on. I think on this one, the president is dead on. I think that when you have closed regimes, what I found working in democracy development was, if I want to stick a dagger in your heart, I've got to do it up close. I cannot do it from 90 miles away. that embargo, the approach that we've had, and again, there are a myriad of reasons why we did that for many years, and it was defensible. But like anything, a boxing match, anything that becomes trench warfare, where you have two sides to get sort of used to everything, you do need to shake it up. And I think in some ways, opening things up to Cuba is sending a message to the Cuban people, which is the problem here is not Uncle Sam. We're actually your good old-fashioned uncle who will, is a pretty good guy. The problem, if there is one in your world, is the government that you have on top of you, and they are the ones that need to do change. So I'm very interested to see now that they've received their spies back. We've talked about normalizing relations. It's very clear that the United States is not going to be invading Cuba, and I think that's a very important message to be sending to the people of Cuba. Now, the next conversation is going to be a very interesting one, which is to the Castro regime and to the rest of the proponents of that approach, which is, it is your country, it is your government. Now you tell the Cuban worker why they can't engage in free commerce.
So you mentioned your father. He instilled in you a really good sense of life and of politics and a fighting spirit, also a Latino heritage. But you're Cuban.
Sure.
This is Southern California. This is Mexico. All right. I mean, how does that play out for you?
For me, it's been a wonderful experience, especially as a writer. And you're right, I was brought up in a Cuban family. My first language was Spanish. I grew up in a Mexican-American neighborhood through the 1980s, where even refugees from Central America were showing up because of all the wars there. I got a master's in Latin American studies. I really am fascinated by, just like in the United States, the differences between Texas and Arizona and California. We all have our different ways of speaking and seeing things. I always kind of laugh that I'm everybody's cousin. I'm used to being a minority. Even in the Latino community, I'm a minority. Many ways that Cubans see life is very different from Mexican Americans or others. If anything, to me, it gave me a real richness to see the world, an ability to see the world through other people's eyes, to judge things through different ways of eating, different ways of going to church, different ways of praying, different ways of having family. So to me, it is the rich tapestry that is Southern California. That's why I love it so much here.
Before we close out, I do want to talk, and we're going to see a picture here of you in your fighting pose. This was after you had a fight. That's your wife, Amanda, with you. It got written up by Frank Mickadite, your colleague at the Orange County Register. But tell us about that, because you almost died.
Boxing is a dangerous sport. It is. I've been in rings my whole life and never had an issue. But a week before that fight, I was sparring with somebody. And again, this is what I love about boxing. A few seconds that I just dropped my hand off of a couple of days of sparring. Basically somebody came over on me with an overhand right, caught me in the exact perfect spot, started a brain bleed. I kept training for another week. This was during the whole Bustamante thing that just blew up. I was working long hours. Nick Berardino, in fact, told me, don't do the fight. You've got too much work going on. You may be too distracted. I insisted, hard-headedness of just keep on training. All that time I didn't know, but I had a brain bleed that was moving and moving and moving and moving. After that fight, which I lost to a split decision, which still bugs me to this day, I walked home and just basically passed out. And what I had was a massive brain bleed that was shifting my brain over. They had to take me to the emergency room. I was a very tough couple of months where doctors had to wait to see if that pressure would go down. They were telling me at the time they might have to drill my head, which I wouldn't be the same afterwards. Thank God, with lots of prayer and lots of assistance from friends, over a few months of a lot of pain. I mean, when you get what they call a subdural hematoma, it is the most painful thing on the planet. But I came out of it okay. Thankfully, with no impacts whatsoever. It's really an amazing thing what your body is capable of doing, even when you do crazy things like hit it in the head. After that, I was told I could never box again. So at this point, I just basically train, hit a bag, work with some trainers on, pads and things like that. Frankly, that's when I shifted to start doing a little bit of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. And here we're looking at a picture now of you in your jiu-jitsu outfit there.
Probably one of my friends from the Gracie Baja gym here in Orange County, which is actually...
So when you're not sparring, you're doing jiu-jitsu.
These days,
you're a fighter.
I like to fight. I like that there's a purity to combat that sometimes politics and government doesn't have.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are there any similarities between boxing and what you do as a journalist?
All day long. When you're in a round and you take you have to work very hard as a reporter to put yourself in a position to land good shots. And that means public records requests, aggressive interviewing. There are a lot of times at the end of the day you're tired, you don't want to pick up that phone and go talk to the mayor, go talk to a county supervisor. You've always got to keep pushing yourself. There are times in the last minute of a round you find out that the story you thought you had is different because you've got different information. And that's where, again, you've got to be true to what you're doing, not be political, not allow the excitement of maybe a good scoop to overtake you, but always stick with the fair shot. You know, you always hit above the belt. And those are the shots that are worth landing. Always in life, that's what, and boxing, jiu-jitsu, there's a certain discipline to it that you have to have as a reporter, especially when it comes to government. You're talking to people on two different sides of almost everything who are really kind of, you know, kicking dust in your feet as the ump.
Wow.
And you've got to really be strong enough to take those different sides and stick with what is the truth.
Real quickly, because we're almost out of time, very briefly, what do you think the biggest issue is facing Orange County?
Wow. I think it's probably growth, both in numbers and demographically, and how we manage that as communities, how we thrive. We're kind of more and more of a built-out community now. Sometimes when you're getting to just expand, it's a different debate. Now it's more of, you're going to see maybe more infill developments and lots of debates about what's acceptable there or not. How you handle tax bases, places like Anaheim. How do they manage tax bases out in the future? How does Orange County handle demographic change? And how do institutions such as local police adapt to that? And how do we, in a conservative jurisdiction, use some unique tools that we have to sort of create accountability measures?
Very good. Well, Norberto, thanks so much. I think the viewers have a sense of your spirit and your fighting spirit. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's it for now. Thanks again to my guest, Norberto Santana. You can watch this test run show at rickreef.com when we launch for good, and that'll be very soon. You'll also be able to watch us on PBS SoCal. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Inside OC.